The air hung thick with tension as Karen slammed her car door and stormed into the auto shop, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the front counter with impatience. "Excuse me?" she snapped, her emerald eyes narrowing at the bewildered mechanic behind the desk. "I specifically told you to clean my car, and it looks even worse than when I dropped it off." The young man, Mike, blinked in confusion, hastily scanning the service order. "Ma'am, I can assure you that we thoroughly cleaned and detailed your vehicle as requested. Perhaps there was some miscommunication." Karen's nostrils flared, and she leaned in, her voice dripping with condescension. "Miscommunication? Are you implying that I don't know how to communicate properly? This is unacceptable. I demand a refund and a complimentary detail job, or I'll make sure your little shop never sees another customer again." Mike's face flushed, and he fidgeted nervously, clearly intimidated by Karen's aggressive tirade. I'm very sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am. Let me go check on your car and see what we can do." As Mike hurried to the back, Karen crossed her arms and tapped her foot impatiently, muttering under her breath about the incompetence of the uneducated working class. This was hardly the first time she had encountered such infuriating service, and she took great pride in her ability to get what she wanted through sheer force of will. When Mike returned, his expression was one of genuine confusion. "Ma'am, I can assure you that your car was meticulously cleaned. There doesn't appear to be any dirt or grime that we missed." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she stomped over to the car, closely inspecting every inch of the gleaming exterior. "What do you mean? Look at this." She ran her finger along the hood, holding it up to Mike's face, the faint smudge of dust clearly visible. Mike sighed, his patience wearing thin. "That's just normal road grime, ma'am. It's impossible to keep a car completely spotless, especially after a drive. We did our best to clean it to your satisfaction." Karen's face contorted with rage, and she slammed her hand on the hood, ignoring the dull thud of pain. "I don't care about your excuses. I paid good money for this service, and I expect perfection. Now, are you going to make this right, or do I need to speak to your manager?" The confrontation was drawing the attention of other customers, and Mike could feel the weight of their disapproving stares. Swallowing his pride, he reluctantly agreed to refund Karen's money and schedule a complimentary detail job, all the while wondering how he had ended up dealing with such an unreasonable and entitled customer. As Karen stormed out of the shop, her designer heels clicking on the concrete floor, she couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. She had won, as she always did, and the mechanic had bowed to her demands. Little did she know, however, that this was just the beginning of a long and tumultuous battle, one that would ultimately test the limits of her entitled behavior. The following week, Karen returned to the auto shop, her face set in a determined scowl. As she approached the counter, Mike, the hapless mechanic, cringed inwardly, bracing himself for another confrontation. Well, if it isn't the incompetent grease monkey," Karen sneered, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming on the counter. "I'm here to collect my car, and it better be spotless this time." Mike took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of his professional composure. "Of course, ma'am. Let me just go retrieve your vehicle." As he disappeared into the garage, Karen settled into one of the worn waiting room chairs, her eyes sweeping the room with disdain. The place was shabby, with outdated magazines and a thin layer of grime on the surfaces. She wrinkled her nose in disgust, already formulating a scathing Yelp review in her mind. When Mike reappeared, Karen practically leaped from her seat, circling the car like a hawk. She bent down, running her finger along the wheel wells, examining it closely for any sign of dirt or grime. "Himph. Well, it seems you've managed to do a halfway decent job this time," she conceded begrudgingly. Mike watched with bated breath, silently praying that his hard work would pass for scrutiny. "I'm glad we were able to meet your standards, ma'am. Please let me know if there's anything else I can assist you with." Karen slid behind the wheel, her eyes narrowed as she started the engine. "We'll see about that," she muttered under her breath, slowly easing the car out of the garage. As she drove home, Karen couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of her stomach. Something about the way the mechanic had looked at her, with a hint of resentment in his eyes, unsettled her. She was used to getting her way, but this time she couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that her victory might have come at a cost. Little did she know, her actions had already set in motion a chain of events that would come back to haunt her. Mike, the seemingly meek and submissive mechanic, had a breaking point, and Karen was about to find out just how far he was willing to go to stand up for himself. The stage was set for a showdown, and Karen, in all her entitled glory, was about to learn a hard lesson about the consequences of her behavior. The real question was, would she be willing to humble herself and make amends, or would her pride and arrogance lead her down a path of further conflict and turmoil? Over the next few days, Karen's mind kept drifting back to the confrontation at the auto shop. She couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that she had somehow crossed a line, that her usual tactics of intimidation and entitlement may have backfired in a way she hadn't anticipated. As she sipped her morning latte, staring out the window of her high-rise apartment, a thought suddenly occurred to her. What if the mechanic, Mike, decided to retaliate? The mere idea made her stomach churn with unease. She had made a powerful enemy, and she knew all too well the lengths that those she had wronged would go to seek their revenge. Pushing aside her unease, Karen tried to rationalize her behavior. After all, she was simply standing up for herself and demanding the level of service she had paid for. Surely, the mechanic couldn't hold that against her. But deep down, she knew that her actions had been fueled by something more than just a desire for perfection. It was a need to assert her dominance, to prove that she was the one in control. As the days turned into weeks, Karen found herself constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected noise or unfamiliar car that passed by her apartment. She started locking her doors and windows obsessively, afraid that the mechanic might attempt to break in and seek retribution. Then, one evening, as she was pulling into her driveway, she noticed a strange van parked a few houses down. Her heart raced, and she quickly ducked down, trying to avoid being seen. Peering through the windshield, she squinted, trying to make out the occupants, her mind racing with wild scenarios of what they might be planning. After what felt like an eternity, the van finally pulled away, and Karen let out a shaky breath. She hurried inside, locking the door behind her and immediately calling the police to report the suspicious vehicle. As the officers took her statement, Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. She was right to be afraid. The mechanic was clearly out to get her. The police would surely take her concerns seriously and provide the protection she needed. Little did she know, however, that her paranoia and overreaction had only served to further inflame the situation. Mike, the mechanic, had been nothing more than a concerned neighbor, worried about the well-being of the elderly couple who lived a few doors down. But now, thanks to Karen's actions, he had been dragged into a situation he never could have imagined, one that would only serve to deepen the rift between them. The stage was set for an escalating conflict, and Karen, in her ever-tightening grip on control, was about to learn a hard lesson about the consequences of her entitled behavior. As the days passed, Karen's paranoia only continued to grow. She jumped at every unexpected sound, constantly scanning the street for any sign of the suspicious van or its occupants. The police had assured her that they would keep an eye on the situation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the mechanic was biding his time, plotting his revenge. One afternoon, as Karen was running errands, she decided to swing by the auto shop, determined to nip this problem in the bud once and for all. Marching up to the counter, she demanded to speak to the manager, her eyes narrowed with accusation. "I've been having some concerns about the safety of my vehicle," she began, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "I can't help but wonder if there might be some sort of sabotage or tampering going on." The manager, a no-nonsense, middle-aged man, raised a skeptical eyebrow. "I can assure you, ma'am, that our mechanics take great pride in their work and would never do anything to jeopardize the safety of our customers' vehicles." Karen leaned in, her manicured nails tapping the counter with impatience. Well, that's simply not good enough. I want a full inspection of my car, and I want it done today. I'll be here to oversee the entire process. The manager opened his mouth to protest, but one look at Karen's determined expression told him it would be a futile endeavor. Sighing in resignation, he called over a technician and arranged for Karen's car to be pulled into the garage. As the hours ticked by, Karen hovered over the mechanics, scrutinizing their every move. She watched with hawk-like intensity as they checked the brakes, the tires, and the engine, searching for any sign of tampering or sabotage. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the manager approached her, his expression neutral. "Ma'am, I can assure you that there is nothing wrong with your vehicle. Our technicians have thoroughly inspected it, and it's in perfect working order." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she crossed her arms defiantly. "Well, that's simply not good enough. I want a written guarantee that my car is safe to drive, and I want it signed by the mechanic who worked on it." The manager's jaw tightened, but he knew better than to argue with her. Summoning the technician, he instructed him to draft the document, all the while silently cursing the day he had agreed to take on such a demanding and unreasonable customer. As Karen finally drove away, her car freshly detailed and her written guarantee in hand, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She had won, once again, and the mechanic had been forced to kowtow to her demands. But deep down, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was only the calm before the storm, that Mike, the mechanic, was biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Little did she know, her actions had set in motion a chain of events that would soon spiral out of her control, leading her down a path of increasingly desperate and reckless behavior. As the weeks passed, Karen's paranoia only continued to intensify. She found herself constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected noise or unfamiliar car that passed by her home. The written guarantee from the auto shop had done little to ease her mind, and she found herself making excuses to avoid driving her car altogether. One day, as she was grocery shopping, she happened to catch a glimpse of Mike, the mechanic, in the produce aisle. Their eyes locked, and Karen felt a chill run down her spine. She quickly turned away, her heart pounding in her chest, and hurried to the checkout, convinced that he was following her. Once safely back home, Karen paced the floor of her living room, her mind racing with irrational fears. What if Mike had tampered with her car again? What if he was planning something even more sinister? She knew she had to take action, but the thought of confronting him directly filled her with dread. Suddenly, an idea struck her. Grabbing her phone, she quickly dialed the non-emergency police number, her voice shaking as she reported a suspicious person lurking near her home. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, and Karen peered out the window, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. As the officers approached Mike, who was simply walking to his car after a day of work, the mechanic's face contorted with confusion and anger. He tried to explain the situation, but the officers, already primed by Karen's frantic call, were having none of it. "Sir, we've received a report of a suspicious person in the area. Can you please come with us and answer a few questions?" Mike's protests fell on deaf ears as the officers escorted him to the patrol car, his hands cuffed behind his back. Karen watched the scene unfold with a twisted sense of satisfaction, convinced that she had finally put an end to the mechanic's scheming. Little did she know, however, that her actions had only served to further escalate the conflict. As Mike sat in the back of the patrol car, his mind raced with fury and disbelief. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was being treated like a criminal, all because of the paranoid ravings of a wealthy, entitled woman. In that moment, Mike's resolve hardened. He had tried to be the bigger person, to let Karen's outbursts slide, but now she had pushed him too far. It was time to fight back, to show her that her money and status couldn't shield her from the consequences of her actions. The stage was set for a showdown, and Karen, in her misguided attempt to regain control, had unwittingly set the wheels in motion. As the police officers led Mike away in handcuffs, Karen stood at her window, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. She had finally put an end to the mechanic's scheming, or so she thought. What Karen didn't know, however, was that Mike had been released shortly after being taken to the police station. The officers, after hearing his side of the story and finding no evidence to support Karen's claims, had quickly realized the situation was nothing more than a misunderstanding. Fuming with anger and humiliation, Mike stormed back to the auto shop, his mind racing with ideas for how to get back at Karen. He had tried to be the bigger person, to let her outbursts slide, but now she had pushed him too far. It was time to fight back, to show her that her money and status couldn't shield her from the consequences of her actions. As the days passed, Karen's paranoia only continued to grow. She found herself constantly on edge, jumping at every unexpected noise or unfamiliar car that passed by her home. The police had assured her that they were keeping a close eye on the situation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Then, one evening, as Karen was pulling into her driveway, she noticed a strange van parked a few houses down. Her heart raced, and she quickly ducked down, trying to avoid being seen. Peering through the windshield, she squinted, trying to make out the occupants, her mind racing with wild scenarios of what they might be planning. After what felt like an eternity, the van finally pulled away, and Karen let out a shaky breath. She hurried inside, locking the door behind her and immediately calling the police to report the suspicious vehicle. But this time, the officers were less than sympathetic. They had already responded to multiple calls from Karen regarding the same van, and they were beginning to suspect that she was the one causing the problem, not the other way around. As the officers left, Karen sank into her chair, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and confusion. What was happening? Why wasn't the police taking her concerns seriously? She knew in her heart that the mechanic was behind all of this, and she was determined to put an end to it once and for all. Little did she know, however, that her actions had only served to further inflame the situation. Mike, the mechanic, had been nothing more than a concerned neighbor, worried about the well-being of the elderly couple who lived a few doors down. But now, thanks to Karen's paranoia and overreaction, he had been dragged into a situation he never could have imagined, one that would only serve to deepen the rift between them. The stage was set for an escalating conflict, and Karen, in her ever-tightening grip on control, was about to learn a hard lesson about the consequences of her entitled behavior. As the days passed, Karen's paranoia only continued to spiral out of control. She found herself jumping at every little noise, convinced that the mechanic was lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. One night, as she was preparing for bed, she heard a strange scratching sound coming from the garage. Her heart pounding, she cautiously made her way downstairs, a heavy flashlight gripped tightly in her hand. Slowly, she pushed the door open, her eyes scanning the darkness. At first, she saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then a movement in the corner caught her eye. Raising the flashlight, she gasped in horror as she realized it was a raccoon rummaging through the contents of her car. Overcome with rage, Karen lunged forward, swinging the flashlight wildly. "Get out of my car, you filthy animal," she screamed, oblivious to the fact that the raccoon was completely unaware of her presence until that moment. The startled creature let out a terrified shriek and scampered out of the garage, knocking over a stack of boxes in the process. Karen stood there, panting heavily, her eyes wild with a mixture of fear and triumph. Convinced that the mechanic had somehow orchestrated this entire incident, she immediately called the police, her voice shaking with hysterical urgency. "There's been a break-in. Someone has tampered with my car, and now there's a wild animal inside," she blurted out, her words tumbling over each other. The officers arrived within minutes, their sirens blaring. They quickly assessed the situation, finding no evidence of an actual break-in or any sign of tampering with Karen's vehicle. "Ma'am, it appears this was simply a case of a raccoon finding its way into your garage," one of the officers said, his tone laced with barely concealed exasperation. "There's no indication of any criminal activity." Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, but her stubborn pride refused to let her back down. "That's impossible. This has to be the mechanic's doing. He's been harassing me ever since I complained about his shoddy work." The officers exchanged a weary glance, realizing that they were dealing with a classic case of an entitled, paranoid individual. Politely but firmly, they informed Karen that unless she could provide concrete evidence of wrongdoing, there was nothing they could do. As the police drove away, Karen stood in the driveway, her fists clenched in frustration. She knew that the mechanic was behind this, and she was determined to prove it, no matter the cost. Little did she know, however, that her actions had only served to further alienate those around her, pushing even the most sympathetic bystanders away. The stage was set for a final confrontation, one that would test the limits of her entitled behavior and the consequences it had unleashed. As the days turned into weeks, Karen's obsession with getting back at the mechanic only continued to grow. She spent countless hours scouring social media and online forums, searching for any shred of evidence that could link him to the incidents in her garage. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find anything concrete. The police had made it clear that they were unwilling to get involved without solid proof, and her neighbors were growing increasingly wary of her erratic behavior. Frustrated and increasingly desperate, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. She knew that the mechanic, Mike, worked late shifts at the auto shop, and one night she made her move. Dressed in dark clothing and armed with a can of pepper spray, Karen crept into the garage, her heart pounding in her chest. She scanned the dimly lit space, her eyes finally landing on Mike's tool bench. With a twisted grin, she reached into her bag and pulled out a jar of industrial-strength glue, carefully applying it to the tools and equipment. As she worked, she couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. This would teach the mechanic a lesson, she thought to herself. No one messed with Karen and got away with it. Just as she was about to make her exit, she heard a noise coming from the back of the garage. Panic seized her, and she quickly ducked behind a stack of tires, her grip on the pepper spray tightening. Moments later, the sound of footsteps echoed through the space, and Karen held her breath, praying that she wouldn't be discovered. To her horror, the footsteps were heading straight towards her hiding spot. Mustering every ounce of her courage, Karen leaped out from behind the tires, her finger on the trigger of the pepper spray. But before she could react, a familiar voice rang out, stopping her in her tracks. "Karen, what the hell are you doing here?" It was Mike, the mechanic, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and anger. Karen froze, her mouth agape, realizing that she had been caught red-handed. In that moment, the weight of her actions finally hit her. She had gone too far, allowing her entitled behavior and thirst for revenge to consume her. As Mike called the police, Karen sank to the floor, her head in her hands, a single tear rolling down her cheek. The story of Karen's downfall had come to a dramatic conclusion, a cautionary tale of the consequences of unchecked entitlement and the destruction it can leave in its wake. For Karen, the once triumphant and unapologetic force of nature, the reckoning had finally arrived, and she was left to face the consequences of her actions, a humbled and broken woman.